All right, and we are live. What's up? If it was in the chat, let me know if the audio is good. Hopefully, there's no issues. Had some issues with these headphones the other day. So, yeah, make sure y'all can hear me. Got somebody. Um, uh, hmm. Okay, I mean, it should be working. It looks like it's picking it up. So, yeah, it's been a minute since we have done one of these. Been a lot going on. Been working a lot, having other life gets gets hectic. A lot going on, but anyway, so tonight, I guess, doing the late night stream, we are looking at um, so like I mentioned in the description, looking at the Farmers Holiday Association. I keep looking back and forth. Sorry, I keep getting distracted by things on the screen. Look at the Farmers Holiday Association and some of the issues that were going on with and during the Great Depression in the Midwest. So, I mean, economic upheaval and whatnot. That's a recurring theme throughout history. And excuse me. Okay, thanks, Henley. Um, so yeah, I was saying, economic upheaval is a recurring theme throughout history. The United States has seen plenty of that, and that kind of serves as the backdrop for this episode. And I think it was like a year or so ago, I ran across a mention of penny auctions, also sometimes referred to as nickel auctions. I think I saw that on Twitter, and I was pretty instantly intrigued by it. And these auctions were basically a form of direct action that was utilized during the Great Depression. So, according to Nebraska studies, which that I'll link to everything that I can. Some of the things I'm referencing are in like databases. So I mean I'll list the title of the paper and everything, but I don't think I didn't link to everything yet. But I'll put all that in the description if anybody wants to check any of this stuff out. So anyway, the process went something basically like this. So quote. A bank would announce that they had to foreclose on a farmer who couldn't pay his or her loan. Then the sheriff would serve the papers, and an auction would be scheduled to sell off the land and equipment that had been pledged against the loan. The bank would hope the proceeds from the sale would amount to most of the money they were losing on the loan. But many farm activists felt that the bankers were being too greedy and that the farmers deserved a break in tough times. So hundreds of farmers would show up at the auction and bid ridiculously low amounts for the equipment and land on the sale. Serious bidders were discouraged sometimes by the threat of violence. Then the activists would turn around and give the material back to the farm family who were in trouble. The proceeds of the first of these sales were $5.35 for equipment that should have brought hundreds or thousands of dollars. In the 30s, these were known as penny auctions, end quote. So I found an article on a website called Socialist Alternative that it kind of fleshed this out a little bit more, where the author writes that, quote, organized farm families would make sure the only bids offered were from their own hand-picked bidders, and the bids would only be a penny for land or livestock or equipment. Then, when the auctioneer finally gave up trying to get higher bids, the auction would end, and the farmer threatened with foreclosure would get back his land, etc., literally for pennies, end quote. And so, Jethro, this is Brooks and Dunn. Let's see if I can, get the shirt in there. Yeah, definitely not you two. What was it Dennis Leary said that about U2? He said, those guys aren't Irish, they wear berets, they're French. So anyway, So yeah, the auctions mostly followed that kind of style, and a first-hand account of these types of auctions is found in an article published in The Nation in March 1933, written by a guy named Ferner Nunn. And let's see, I have that. Yeah, here it is. So, nope, that's the wrong one. Give me 1 second here. Or is that the right one? Sorry, y'all. Let me make sure want to make sure I'm reading from the right. Yes, okay, this is the right one. So yeah, in this Ferner Nunn article in The Nation, he's describing a farming community where describing the people who showed up to this auction, that he said they're neighbors of a farmer who can no longer pay interest on a $2,000 mortgage. These farmers have known him for years. They know he would pay if he could. They know the debt and the interest are 3 times as hard to pay off now as when the mortgage was given. Some of them know that soon their own property may be endangered by defaults. They know that this particular mortgage was given on stock and that the farmer has offered the stock in settlement. And they know that the mortgagee refused the offer, demanding a sale instead, a sale of personal property as provided by law. And yeah, so then he goes on to describe the auction itself, where someone, people were bidding $2 on a horse. People were, let's see, where yeah, so 3 more horses are offered. They are knocked down to the farmer with no other bids for $10, $8, $1.50. The machinery comes next: a hay rack, a wagon, 2 plows, a binder, rake, mower, disc harrow, cultivator, pulverizer, $1, 50 cents, 50 cents, a quarter, a half a dollar, sold to the farmer. His means of livelihood are saved to him. So yeah, I mean, like I said, if anybody wants to read more about this, I'll link that in the description later. But it kind of gives a look at where these, kind of how the auctions were run. Oh, okay. Let's see. So that's kind of the basic structure of the auctions. And they function somewhat differently depending on the auction. The outcome was effectively the same. Let's see what's going on in this. Something's going on in the chat here. Yes, I did. I cut my hair like 2 weeks ago. I shaved it all off, and I was like, "This is cool. I'm good with this." And then, like a week later, I shaved it again, and I was like, "Why did I do that? I should have just left it how it was." So yes, big private Joker vibes for sure. But anyway, so when I first heard about these penny auctions, I was pretty struck by the level of camaraderie within the communities where it happened, particularly because I don't really see that type of community cohesion and cooperation happening anywhere in the United States these days. I think that the breakdown of communities has been a long, slow descent into basically total social atomization. I mean, the reasons for that are myriad, but I've certainly noticed it accelerating in the post 11th day of September event that happened 21 years ago now. That this kind of world where fear, distrust, and paranoia have become the norm when dealing with others, even and sometimes especially neighbors. But as I was saying about the penny auctions, this is when I felt like I had to research it further. So initially, it was kind of difficult to find much information on it, but I combed through an academic database, JSTOR, as I've mentioned. I think I mentioned that on one of the last streams. I'm a big fan. And so I found a handful of articles and papers on about the struggles of farmers in the upper Midwest in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And as I was researching, a name that kept appearing is Milo Reno and the Farmers Holiday Association, which was a direct action oriented organization that he co-founded. So I thought the guy was kind of interesting. It's kind of a cool name, Milo Reno. So before we get into that, yeah, I'm sure the people who are watching live or right now are very familiar with direct action. But for anybody watching later who may not be, it's basically it's a kind of a broad term, but it basically describes activities that are utilized to bring about political or social change that are outside of the political system. So, for example, things like voting or negotiation or diplomacy that's not directed action. Whereas like picketing, blocking roads, protesting, marching, sit-in, sabotage, things like this. These kinds of activities are generally split into two different categories, where you have violent direct action and nonviolent direct action. So violent direct action is obviously things like assault, kidnapping, things that harm another person. So some people consider activities such as arson or property destruction to be violent, whereas others don't. And there's a lot of varying opinions on that matter, but that's not what anyway, that's a whole other conversation. But David Graeber wrote in his essay titled "The New Anarchist" that the notion of direct action rejects a politics, quote, which appeals to governments to modify their behavior in favor of physical intervention against state power in a form that itself prefigures an alternative, end quote. So to apply this to the Farmers Holiday Association, William Pratt writes in his paper, Rethinking the Farm Revolt of the 1930s, that, quote, the holiday, as well as the United Farmers League, was more of a direct action movement than any other agrarian uprising of the Northern Plains. Unlike earlier economic movements, the holiday did not promote cooperatives or other enterprises, and unlike earlier agrarian political movements, it did not attempt to gain public office. Now some of its participants did benefit politically through their involvement. The holiday itself did not become a partisan political machine. No other farm movement in the region's history provided to be as decentralized and subject to local direction. National and state leaders might recommend a course of action, but county units were virtually autonomous and decided themselves what should be done in given situations, end quote. So with all that in mind, to get back to Milo Reno, information about him is pretty scattered, in the sense you kind of have to dig for it a little bit, and then there's just not a lot of information about him, at least, as far as I was able to find. Also, some of the biographical information on Reno is conflicting. So I just kind of do the best I could in vetting the sources, reading all of them thoroughly, and kind of bringing all the information together. So according to Spartacus Educational, he was one of 13 children. He had a strong interest in Christian theology and appeared to have had pretty radical beliefs from an early age. Now, just as a quick side note, the word radical gets thrown around a lot. I use it in this case, like strictly in the political sense. Radical has kind of taken on certain connotations in recent years, where it's been conflated with extremism. But all it means is the intent to replace an existing political or social system through reforms or various kinds of change, including structural and systemic types of change. So it can be more or less used synonymously with revolutionary, but it differs significantly, like I said, from extremism, which it's often conflated with. So anyway, Reno came up with the idea of a farmer strike, which was modeled on the strikes and direct action efforts of the labor unions, which is a topic I'm planning to get to in future episodes, which will hopefully come more quickly. There'll be less time between them. But anyway, the basic idea of the strike was to stop the flow of products from the farms to the markets. The intent was to create artificial shortages, which would increase demand due to the limited supply, and thus raise prices and keep the farmers from continuing to go into the red. Now, to put this all in context, Joel Dinger, not sure how to pronounce his name exactly, he wrote a paper titled The Farmers Holiday Association in Eastern Iowa, 1932 to 1933, which provided a treasure trove, really, of information on the organization, its tactics, and the economic and social climate that it arose in. So his paper, which again, I'll link in the description because this is one that's actually, you can find it, a PDF of it online without having, get into a database or anything. Provides really good, like I said, information on the Farmers Holiday Association. So I'll read a little bit from that, and it gets into some numbers, which I know is not always terribly exciting, but I think it's pretty important to understand what's going on. So reading from Dinger's paper here, the Farmers Holiday Association can trace its roots back to the time period following World War I. Because of the war's effects on Europe, there was an enormous increase in demand for agricultural products from the United States. To encourage farmers to raise their production, the government put price supports into effect. As a result, prices for agricultural products skyrocketed, especially for wheat and hogs. Farm income in the U.S. rose to an all-time high of $16.9 billion in 1919. Prices were roughly twice their pre-war average. Concurrent to this increased production, land values were rising. Much of the increase was attributed to rampant speculation, as only a 10% down payment would purchase a farm. Land prices rose almost 160% during World War I. High land prices combined with increased profits made farming as prosperous a venture as it had ever been. Many farmers tried to plant as much as they could, even to the point of tearing out fences in order to plant crops up to the edge of the road. The highly optimistic spirit of the immediate post-war period came crashing down quickly. As Europe recovered, the demand for farm commodities abroad diminished. Many countries imposed tariffs which made foreign trade difficult for Midwestern farmers. Canada and Argentina began to compete with the U.S., especially in the wheat market. Consumer demand for wheat and pork in the U.S. also diminished during the 1920s. Furthermore, government price supports were lifted in 1920. All of these factors combined to create headaches for the farm community. Supply was high to begin with, and since so much land was in production, the situation was exacerbated. Prices plunged rapidly. By 1921, gross farm income had dropped to $8.9 billion. Land prices fell from an average of $57.36 an acre in 1920 to $35.40 in 1930. The price issue was not the only concern facing farmers because credit was so easy to come by during the 1920s and land values were inflated. The average farmer debtor had a huge burden to carry. The average size of a new loan in Iowa was $11,080 in 1920 as compared to the national average of $4,270. Iowa had 1,763 banks in 1920, more than any other state. As prices fell, many of the smaller banks closed or began to foreclose upon loans. In 1929, the markets crashed. Wheat prices dropped from $1.03 per bushel in 1929 to 67 cents in 1930 and down to 38 cents in 1932. Hog prices fell from $11.36 per head in 1931 to $6.14 in 1932 and down to $4.21 in 1933. Other farm commodity prices fell in a similar manner. And then the crash of 1929 put pressure on investors. When they had to call on their assets, they in turn put pressure on the farmer debtors. Many couldn't survive. In 1931, 31.2 farms per 1,000 were foreclosed upon in Iowa. By 1932, the number was 52.5. In 1933, 78.3 farms per 1,000 were foreclosed upon in Iowa, at the highest rate in our nation's history. Overall, the north central region of the U.S. had the highest rate of foreclosures in the country. 6% of farms in Iowa, North Dakota, and South Dakota changed ownership through foreclosure or bankruptcy in 1932, and another 8% did so in 1933. The 1920s and 1930s were not a field of dreams for farmers in Iowa. They were upset that their purchasing power was down as much as 67% from pre-World War I levels. They were frustrated that the prices they were receiving for their products was sinking fast, while the prices they paid at the market were unchanged. So, yeah, I mean, pretty, like I said, there's a lot of numbers in there, but I think it definitely kind of gives context way to how they got here. Um, so yeah, I mean, to put it mildly, things are not going well. And according to Kim E. Nielsen, one idea that Reno vocally and enthusiastically supported was the idea of cost of production. It was at the time a new idea. Nielsen writes that cost of production means, quote, the cost to a farmer of producing a marketable crop. Theoretically, this amount was determined by an analysis of interest rates on land and equipment, the depreciation of buildings and machinery, and the price of seed and fertilizer. In reality, however, the cost of production was whatever it took for farm families to get by. And in June 1932, for example, with gross farm income half of what it had been the previous year, getting by was much more difficult than earlier. Corn, which cost 92 cents a bushel to produce, sold for 10 cents, end quote. All right, we'll check it out, see what's going on in the chat here. Ask Gil about corn. He'll actually come up. He's coming up here pretty soon. What's up, Jerry? Thanks for tuning in. Jethro, Henley, thanks to y'all for coming and hanging out live. Yeah, much appreciated. We hardcore Kutskiites, yes. Thank you, Henley. Indeed, much appreciated. Okay, so we'll get back into this here. So, as often the case in studying history, things are complex, convoluted, and there was rarely, if ever, one reason for why anything happens. It's also worth mentioning at the time, while the Farmers Holiday Association was a unified organization for the most part, there was a lot of diversity among the local groups. Pratt, who I mentioned earlier, he sums it up pretty well in his paper that I referenced a few moments ago, where he writes that the movement was not monolithic, and an examination of its efforts in individual locales frequently show important divergences. Farm protest was not simply struck from one mold, but was shaped by local history and custom and by local personalities, end quote. So it probably goes without saying that what we're doing here is an overview of this movement and getting like a big picture idea of it, because focusing on every specific group or individual members is far outside the scope of this live stream. But anyway, Lisa L. Ossian, hopefully I'm saying her name right, writes that since the end of the Great War, farmers had experienced the stresses of deprivation, poverty, and constant worry. Their problems were many and varied: depressed foreign markets, fewer domestic markets due to population shifts and diet changes, increased farm mortgage debt, overproduction of farm crops and animals, increased mechanization with resulting maintenance cost, overtilled marginal farmland, continued reluctance of farm families to leave for city jobs, and drastic drop in farm prices, end quote. Ossian's paper also features a quote from a guy named Oscar Helene, who was a farmer in western Iowa during this era. Excuse me. Helene said, quote, "The farmer is a pretty independent individual. He wants to be a conservative individual. He wants to be an honorable individual. He wants to pay his debts, but it was hard. The rank and file people of this state who were brought up as conservatives, and most of us were, would never act like this, except in desperation. What I remember most of those times is that poverty creates desperation, and desperation creates violence," end quote. Let's see. Get back to the notes here. Okay, so the fact of the matter is that none of the research I've done, has backs like the research I've done is backs this up. I've never seen anything that led me to believe that any of these farmers were just trying to get out of paying their debts, trying to avoid financial responsibility. And so I think that Helene's comments were true about the farmers of that era. I mean, when you're facing a situation like some of these farmers were, where they're losing 82 cents on every bushel of corn, it's bound to drive people to undertake extreme action because they don't, I mean, they can see how they don't have any other choice. I mean, that's something you can see how people could get to that point. So yeah, I mean, to quickly go back to Werner Nunn's article in The Nation that I read from earlier, in describing the scene at the penny auction he witnessed, where a farmer was about to have all of his livestock and equipment auctioned off, and he wrote that the farmers who were gathered said, quote, have known him for years. They know he would pay if he could. They know the debt and interest are 3 times as hard to pay off as when the mortgage was given. Some of them know that soon their own property may be endangered by defaults. They know that this particular mortgage was given on stock and that the farmer had offered the stock in settlement. They know the mortgagee refused it. I think, did I read that already? Okay, I feel like I read this part already. Whatever, I'll read it again. And they knew that the mortgagee refused the offer, demanded a sale instead, a sale of personal property as defined by law. End quote. So, yeah, I mean, now we've could have covered what penny auctions look like and how they functioned, seen some background on Milo Reno, who was the guy, like I said, who started the Farmers Holiday Association, and looked at some of the economic, social, and political conditions that gave rise to the FHA. We'll look at what the FHA actually, exactly what it was. So an article that was published in the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Encyclopedia of the Great Plains give probably the most thorough and succinct picture of the FHA that I've found. And I'll read a bit from it here, where it says that the Farmers Holiday Association grew out of the National Farmers Union, an organization that lobbied for farm aid and tariff reform, as well as operating, purchasing, and sales cooperatives. The name referred to the famous bank holiday, farmers noting that if bankers could take a holiday to reorder their business, they should be allowed to do the same. The National Farmers Union and the Farmers Holiday Association remained closely linked, in part because the primary leader of the Farmers Holiday Association, Milo Reno, had also been the head of the Iowa Farmers Union. Milo Reno remained central to the organization well past its peak in 1933, and the Iowa chapter was the strongest and most active branch of the organization. I'll skip ahead here a little bit. It notes that association members never constituted a majority of farmers in any region, which weakened their position and virtually guaranteed conflict with their neighbors. So you can see this kind of a contentious issue, where they couldn't really gain the support that they needed. Unions have always been kind of a contentious issue in the U.S. So, yeah, it says that the mechanism for change would be the farm strike or holiday, where the original plan, as conceived by Reno and advocated by him as early as 1921, would call for farmers to cease selling their products or buying anything from anyone. What gave the movement power and importance was the unplanned radical behavior of its members who, acting without instructions from official leadership, barricaded roads and forced non-striking farmers to turn away from the markets. Strikers, barricade runners, and law enforcement officers all committed acts of violence. There were a few deaths. Now, that it mentions that here, and I don't know if they had a source for that, not to be all like, oh, what's your source for that? But I couldn't really find anything else about people like actually getting killed in direct relation to the FHA. So that I'm not sure about. And like I looked, I couldn't, wasn't able to dig anything up about it. So anyway, like I said, it's a short piece, and I'll link that below. And if anybody wants to read more about that. Let's see. What's happening in the chat? Greatest farmer ever, Jethro Tull. Buffalo is a never-ending hoth. Yes, that's what I hear. I've never been to Buffalo, but I know a guy who's from Buffalo, and he lives down here now, and he said he doesn't want to go back because it's too cold. So you think people get used to it living up there, but guess not. Anyway, so yeah, to go back to Dinger's paper for a second, he writes a quote, "The fact that hostilities ended so rapidly after the government began its aid programs to farmers points out a glaring fact. The farm revolts of 1932 to 1933, as seen by most of the farmers who participated in them, were directed at getting some sort of help, not at gaining cost of production guarantees or any other legislative agenda, as Milo Reno believed. The stated activities of the FHA were not what drove the farmers to action, and Reno went to the grave in 1936, feeling his efforts had been in vain. In actuality, though, the farm revolts had accomplished what most farmers had wanted all along," end quote. So, yeah, one thing I forgot to mention there was there were government programs that were enacted to aid farmers and during the kind of downturn when they were struggling. So this is interesting, particularly in light of the mention of the FHA cells having a pretty high degree of autonomy. So that's one of the obvious struggles when creating association that exists in multiple or even numerous different locations, where each individual chapter, it isn't ruled over with an iron fist. So I guess you could say it's maybe like quasi-anarchist. In that it allows for people to come in and join the struggle who may not necessarily be on the same page as the founders of the movement. And when you read up on Reno, it becomes pretty apparent that he was a very effective organizer and speaker. He was not up to the task of leading a movement. So that's not to denigrate him, obviously, but it's just commending him for his strengths as an orator and an organizer, while recognizing the FHA didn't really achieve longevity. It had basically dried up completely by 1934. So yeah, like I mentioned with the aid, my notes are a little bit out of order here, but like I mentioned with the aid programs a moment ago, we can't place I would say even half of the blame on Reno, or yeah, I don't think he's terribly responsible for the collapse of the FHA, because a lot of that had to do with Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal policy. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but it's worth mentioning at least briefly, because it kind of rounds out this whole saga. But before we get into that, just a quick side note that I found that was interesting was the reaction of law enforcement to the farm revolts and the penny auctions. So like much of what we saw in the history of the Depression era farm revolts, the responses varied pretty widely. Some sheriffs tried to crack down and were met with intense resistance from the farmers, while others were sympathetic. As Pratt writes, quote, "The attitude of local authorities also was important. The popular image is that of embattled farmers facing armed sheriffs, and there are numerous such confrontations that are documented. On the other hand, some local law enforcement officials acted in collusion with holiday activists and made themselves unavailable in crucial situations," end quote. So anyway, to just take a few moments to discuss the New Deal policies and the effect they had on the HFA, we'll look really quickly at sort of a precursor to the New Deal policies on a small scale. As Nielsen writes that on April 18th, 1933, then governor of Minnesota, Floyd B. Olson, who was apparently a pretty staunch supporter of the FHA, he signed a mortgage moratorium bill into law that had been proposed by the association. Minnesota Farm Holiday President John Bosch used this victory to spur the crowd into being more active within the FHA, and said that, quote, "Any government, anytime, is as oppressive as the people will submit to," end quote. So we can see the FHA was gaining some ground, at least in Minnesota, but despite this, further plans were made for strikes, but they never materialized for a variety of reasons, particularly because it wasn't enough to just withhold, say like butter or pork, but it would have to be all produce, and meat would have to be withheld from going to market. So, some farmers just didn't see an all-out strike as an option. So, given how abysmal the markets were, some farmers couldn't afford to miss out on the money that they could bring in from selling their crops, regardless of how small the sum was. So, in any case, the programs that were implemented directly put money into the pockets of the farmers and alleviated at least some of their financial woes. For example, the National Corn Loan Program, according to Nielsen, saw farmers receiving between 30 and 35 cents per bushel of corn that was stored under seal, and this amount was about 10 cents over what the market price was at that time. So that put a pretty swift end to the strike, and a month later, the first checks under the new program were sent out to farmers. All right, let's see what's going on in the chat here. Take a quick break. What's a good Brooks and Dunn song? All of them. Neon Moon, Brand New Man, Boot Scoot and Boogie. Yeah, list goes on and on and on. Brand New Man is, I would say, definitely up there. That and Neon Moon, they're two best. What's up, John? Thanks for joining. All right. Boot Scoot Kootski. I think I'm going to change my YouTube name to that now. So anyway, yeah, I mean, like I said, that there were in that one piece I read from it mentioned that there were killings related to the FHA was involved in. Like I said, I couldn't really find anything about that. But I mean, there were some, to be fair, yeah, like some kind of less palatable forms of direct action that were undertaken by FHA members. So, I'm not here to pass any moral judgments on anybody, because as we saw with that quote from that farmer, Oscar Helene, earlier, desperation can drive people to do things they might not even consider doing in more ideal circumstances. So again, to go back to Dinger's paper, where he wrote that about some of the direct action that took place in the fall of 32, he writes a quote, on November 14th, over 100 farm pickets stopped a truck driver carrying a truckload of poultry to Chicago outside of Clinton. The driver was escorted back to Clarence. On the 16th, nearly 100 deputies were called out to disperse a crowd of over 100 pickets, resulting in 13 arrests. So this action followed the actions of a mob a day earlier, when trucks were stopped, had their tires punctured, and were pelted with bricks. So fortunately, no serious injuries occurred. And then later, on November 16th, a warehouse owned by the Toronto Creamery burned to the ground. 3 local FHA activists were later tried and convicted of setting fire to the building. And then on the 20th, a Milwaukee Railroad bridge between Wheatland and Big Rock burned, end quote. So yeah, kind of along with that same point, there's an article I found while I was researching that was published in the Chicago Tribune in February 1985, where a guy named Richard Orr, who wrote the article, was talking about, it was comparing the troubles faced by the farmers of the 80s with the struggles faced by the farmers in the 20s and 30s with the struggles faced by farmers in the mid 1980s. And the article kind of rubbed me the wrong way, because I found it was pretty tone deaf and kind of sneering and bad faith, especially when you consider the guy who wrote it is the rural affairs writer. There seemed to be a lot of contempt for rural people from this guy. So he kind of outright dismisses the farm revolts of the 1930s as being violent when, as we've seen, like I said, from my research, maybe people out there have other research that I wasn't able to dig up, um, that there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of actual violence. I'm talking like, actually physically harming another person. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to try to whitewash these. And yeah, I mean, there were acts that some people might say were threatening or violence. Like there was a judge who was threatened with the noose. There was a case of people locking law enforcement officers in hen houses, which is kind of funny. Um, and there are reports of people showing up to the penny auctions with guns, ropes, pitchforks, but those were never used, as best I could find. Um, but anyway, so yeah, I mean, it seems those incidents were pretty few and far between. But this to that point, I mean, to go back to the essay by David Graeber I mentioned earlier, where he writes about how the American mainstream media tends to paint any protest where property is damaged or destroyed as being violent, even when no one is physically harmed. Um, and so, in this Chicago Tribune article, Orr attempts to link farm protests in the 1960s, where milk was dumped and livestock was killed, to so-called violent protests in the 1930s, and even goes as far as to attempt to link the tractor cage, which took place in the 1970s, where farmers rode their tractors to Washington, D.C. in protest. And what really got me was where Orr writes the tractors cost between $75,000 and $100,000 and says that this was, quote, to demonstrate how poor they were, end quote, like the farmers. I don't know if he thought he was like being clever or if he's just callous or if he's just dumb. I don't know what the case is here. Um, but what I'm getting at is the fact that, farming is a tough way to make a living. It always has been. And the fact of the matter is the farmers don't set the prices on tractors and have to pay exorbitant amounts of money for equipment that is utilized in a way of life, an occupation that doesn't pay much. It's arguable, I mean, that's like how you get into these positions is they're kind of at the corporations, John Deere, whoever makes the International Harvest or whatever makes the tractor. Oh, it's $100,000. It's probably way more than that now. And if you want to farm, got to pay for it. Don't really have any options. So farming is going to become prohibitively expensive for a lot of families, and which we now see agriculture being taken over by corporations and billionaires, which just my opinion I think is disgusting, and it's also troubling for what that means for the future. Excuse me. There was actually a great article that was published in The Guardian about 2 years ago that talks about this. I don't think I have that one printed out, so I have to see if I can find that one. Yes, it was recently reported in the Land Report that Bill Gates has snatched up 242,000 acres of productive farmland in the U.S. I think it's higher than that now. Data from the Land Report that was reported by the USA Today in 2019 shows that Ted Turner, who says that we should, kill 95% of people on Earth, he owns 2 million acres of ranch land in the U.S., and John Malone owns 2.2 million acres of ranch land in the U.S. And I mean, it's a shame to see what's happening to farming in the U.S. I mean, between the rapidly vanishing family farms and the breakdown of authentic communities in the U.S., it's a pretty sad state of affairs. And I mean, the number of family farms and ranches are dwindling, and then we see these like deranged billionaires, who appear to be the only people, who are becoming the only people who can really afford to farm these days, and they're snatching up as much land as they can get, which, like I said, is a disturbing trend. So, anyway, but yeah, so the reason I'm kind of bringing it up to the present day is you can see these problems have been going on, and yeah, I mean, it may seem obvious, but this is just like another development in the saga of family farmers, the people who fed this country for decades and decades. getting squeezed by the wealthy. Back in the 1930s, it was bankers and mortgage companies who were crushing farmers, and now it's equipment manufacturers charging, insane amounts of money for their products. And I'm sure the products cost a lot to make. I get that's another issue, but now, you see the billionaires and corporations undercutting the farmers today and hoarding as much farmland in the U.S. for themselves as they can get. But while we're on that subject, it's important to note that during the 1930s, in many cases, the farmland was not actually owned by the farmers themselves. As John Timken points out, under the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which paid farmers to not grow crops or produce dairy products in order to decrease supply, in order to raise prices, that money was paid. The money that was paid out, it went to the landowners. So now the landowners were supposed to pay the farmers their fair share of the money, but surprise, surprise, most of the landowners kept all the money for themselves. Imagine that. Just to wrap up here, there's a quote from William C. Pratt's paper that I've mentioned several times, where he writes a quote, "The farm revolt of the 1930s, like earlier rural movements, consisted of numerous local efforts. Here, neighbors often organized and mobilized neighbors, people with whom they had a background of association over a period of time. With outside help on occasion, these men and women worked with others whom they already knew or knew about. Together they protected what they had and perhaps enhanced it as well." End quote. So, that's pretty much everything I had on that. It's pretty interesting kind of chain of events, and kind of seeing where, like I said, some of these problems that you see happening, 90 years ago, almost a century ago now, are still happening today. And it's not to go like full socialist or anything, but it's really, it comes down to the haves and the have-nots, and the people who provide the food are the ones who are getting squeezed. So yes, big tractor sets the prices. Indeed, big pharma. Yeah, good point, John. Bill Gates owns like 90% Mississippi farms through cutouts. Wow, that is not surprising. Which is, yeah. What are you going to do? There's got to be something that can be done. I don't know what that is, but anyway, that, like I said, that was everything I had. So thanks to everybody who tuned in live, and if you enjoyed what you saw, like the video, subscribe if you're not. That'd be great, and leave a comment. And tomorrow I'm going to I'll make a note so I remember to come back and put all the sources in the description. So like I said, in case anybody wants to do any more reading on this or anything like that, I always try to put that there. So you never know. Some people are really interested in this kind of stuff, and some people just more casual listening, and either way is fine. So anyway, thank you all. Thanks to John, Jethro, Henley, and Jerry, the Iceman. He was in the chat earlier. I don't see him now. Thanks you all for tuning in, and hopefully I'll have another stream coming up here pretty soon. I will see you all next time.